She crossed half a continent to reach a man who looked her in the eye and told her she wasn't worth keeping. The coach hadn't even finished rolling to a stop when Margaret Hale felt it, that cold, particular silence of a crowd that already knows something you don't. She stepped down into the dust of Coldwater Ridge with one worn leather trunk, 2 years of letters folded against her chest, and every reasonable hope she had left in this world. What she got instead was a public humiliation so complete, so deliberate, that even the horses looked away. If you've ever been left standing in front of everyone with nothing left to lose, stay with me. This story is for you. Drop your city in the comments below. Let me see how far this story travels. The overland stage out of Fort Benton didn't believe in comfort and didn't apologize for it. Margaret Hale had been sitting wedged between a heavy-set whiskey drummer named Pollard and the left interior wall of the coach for 11 hours. And in that time, she had learned 3 things about Mr. Pollard. He snored with his whole body, he smelled of camphor and something worse underneath it, and he had absolutely no awareness of how much space he was occupying in the world. She'd pressed herself as close to the window as she could manage without actually climbing through it, watching the Montana Territory scroll past in the late afternoon gold. Lodgepole pines and broken shale and elk meadows going orange in the fading light. And she told herself, the way she had been telling herself for 2 weeks of travel, that it was almost over. The letter from Thomas Greer was folded in the inside pocket of her coat, against her ribs, where she'd put it the day she left Ohio. She'd stopped reading it somewhere around the Missouri crossing. She had it memorized by then anyway, but she kept it there because it was the closest thing she had to a guarantee. Come to Coldwater Ridge, he'd written, in that careful school teacher's hand she remembered from their childhood, before his family had gone west. I have built something here. A home, a business, a future. I would be honored if you would share it with me. I believe we would suit each other well. She was 31 years old. She had a father 2 years in the ground, a mother 12 years before that, and a cousin's household in Columbus where she had spent the better part of a decade being quietly useful and quietly overlooked. Thomas Greer's letter had arrived on a Thursday in February, and by the following Monday she had written back to accept. She was not naive about it. She understood, with the clear-eyed practicality of a woman who had survived on very little for a very long time, that this was not a love story. It was an arrangement between 2 sensible adults who remembered each other fondly from another life. Thomas was a practical man. She was a practical woman. The frontier was full of practical marriages that had grown into something warmer with time and shared labor, and she had seen enough of the alternative, the grand romantic notions that curdled into bitterness the moment real life applied pressure, to feel comfortable with the trade. She had not expected magic. She had expected a chance. The coach hit a rut and lurched hard to the left, slamming Pollard's elbow into her shoulder and jolting awake the elderly woman across from her, who said, "Lord have mercy," and immediately went back to sleep. Margaret caught herself on the window frame and looked out at the road ahead. The pines were thinning now, and she could see the first rooftops of a settlement climbing the lower slope of the mountain, raw lumber and stone chimneys, a main street no more than 2 blocks long, a water tower against the sky. Coldwater Ridge, population 400 and some change according to Thomas's letters. Elevation 6,200 feet, hard winters and short summers, and the kind of people who stayed put not because they loved the land, but because leaving cost more than they had. She checked her hair with one hand, smoothed the front of her traveling coat as best she could in the cramped space, and sat straight. Whatever she looked like, dusty, road pale, worn thin from 2 weeks of bad sleep and worse food, she would walk off that coach with her shoulders back. That much she could control. The coach pulled in at 5:15 in the afternoon. There were maybe 30 people in the vicinity of the main street when it rolled to a stop in front of the general store, the largest building on the block, with a covered porch running the length of the front and a hand-lettered sign above the door that read, "Greer's Dry Goods and Sundries." Some of the crowd had business there. Some were just finishing up the day's work and heading home. A few were simply standing in the way that people stand in small towns when something is about to happen and they can feel it even if they don't know what it is yet. Margaret saw Thomas Greer before he saw her. He was standing at the edge of the porch steps, wearing a clean shirt and a vest, his hat in his hands. He was taller than she remembered, and he had the particular kind of lean that came from years of hard country living. He had the look of a man waiting for something he'd ordered and wasn't sure would arrive in the right condition. The driver came down from the box and opened the door. Pollard went first, spilling out with his sample cases and a grunt of relief. The elderly woman after him. Then Margaret stepped down, one hand on the door frame, her trunk already being pulled from the boot by the driver's assistant, and she lifted her eyes to Thomas Greer across 20 feet of packed dirt. He looked at her, she looked at him, and she knew. The way you know before anyone says a word. The way bad news always arrives on your own body before it arrives in language. His expression had done something she couldn't quite name. Not disgust, exactly. More like a man who had ordered one thing from a catalog and received something else entirely, and was now calculating whether it was worth the effort to return it. She walked toward him anyway, because there was nothing else to do. Thomas! She stopped at the foot of the porch steps. I'm glad to finally... Miss Hale. His voice was not unkind. That almost made it worse. It was the voice of a man reading from a prepared statement. I appreciate that you've made such a long journey. I want you to know I mean no disrespect. The street had gone quiet around them. She could feel it. The attention of 30 people narrowing to a point, focused on the two of them, the way a crowd always goes still when it senses blood. Thomas, she said again, more quietly this time. What's happened? He looked down at the hat in his hands. He turned it once. I've given this a great deal of thought, and I've come to the conclusion that we wouldn't suit after all. I'm sorry to tell you this way. I know this isn't how it should go. The street didn't gasp. It didn't make any sound at all. It just listened. Margaret stood very still. She was aware of every piece of herself. The dust in her hair, the travel-worn state of her coat, the trunk sitting in the dirt behind her, the 11 hours in a coach pressed against a stranger's elbow, the 2 weeks of bad food and no sleep, the 2 years of letters folded against her ribs, the 2 years of letters she had convinced herself counted for something. You invited me here, she said. The sentence came out flat and factual, because that was all she had. I know that. You asked me to come. Specifically, you wrote, I know what I wrote. He looked up then, and she saw it in his eyes. Not cruelty, but something worse in its own way, a kind of embarrassed resolve. He had made up his mind before she got off the coach. He'd probably made up his mind before she left Ohio. I thought I knew what I wanted. I was wrong. I'm sorry, Margaret. He hadn't called her Margaret since a letter 3 years ago. The familiarity of it, dropped in at this moment, felt like an insult she couldn't articulate. I see, she said. There's a boarding house on the east end of town. I'll cover your room for 2 weeks. That should give you time to make arrangements to... I didn't ask you for charity. His jaw tightened. I'm trying to do the right thing. You're trying to feel better about what you've already done. She said it quietly, still, without particular heat. It was simply true. And she knew it was true, and she said it because someone had to. Don't dress it up. That landed. She could see it land. His neck went red above the collar. Around them, nobody moved. Somebody's horse shifted at the hitching post and jangled its bit, and that was the only sound for a long moment. Then from the far edge of the porch, a voice. She had not noticed him before, and she wasn't sure anyone else had either, which seemed to be exactly how he preferred it. He was leaning against the far corner post of the porch, tall, dark-coated, with a weathered face that belonged to a man who had spent years in places that didn't offer any shelter from anything. He had the kind of stillness that wasn't laziness, but the exact opposite of it. A man who had learned somewhere along the way that the less you moved, the more you saw. He was watching the whole scene the way you'd watch a fire, not for entertainment, but to assess the damage. That's enough, Tom, he said. His voice wasn't loud. He didn't raise it at all. But something about it, the lack of performance in it, the absence of any need to persuade, made it carry. Thomas Greer looked over at him. Something shifted in Greer's expression, not quite fear. Closer to the awareness that whatever ground he was standing on had just gotten uncertain. This isn't your business, Mercer. Woman came 3 states over on your invitation. The man pushed off the post and stepped to the edge of the porch, looking down at the street. He didn't look at Thomas when he said it. He looked at Margaret. Standing in the open with her trunk in the dirt while the whole town watches. That makes it everybody's business. Margaret looked up at him. He He met her eyes for a moment, not with pity, which she couldn't have stood, but with a directness that was almost startling in its simplicity, as if he was simply acknowledging that she was a person standing there, which somehow, in the last 5 minutes, had been more than anyone else had managed to do. "Sir," she said carefully, I'm not offering anything yet." He came down the porch steps, slowly, and stopped a few feet from her. He was big, she noticed now, not in the showy way of men who wanted you to know it, but in the settled, matter-of-fact way of a man who'd built his body doing hard work in hard country. He had a trapper's hands. He had a face that had been broken in at least one place and hadn't been particularly concerned about it. "You got somewhere to be tonight?" She paused. "No." "Got someone in this town expecting you, besides him?" She glanced at Thomas, who was watching this exchange with an expression caught between relief and injury. A man watching someone else handle a mess he'd made. "No. I've got a cabin." He said it the way you'd describe a weather system. Factual, no decoration. "It's a day's ride up the mountain. Cold, needs work, nothing fancy. You'd have a roof and a bed and nobody bothering you. That's all I'm offering." Around them, she could feel the crowd processing this. She saw a woman in a gray dress on the far side of the street lean toward the woman next to her and say something too quiet to hear. She saw the general store's front window, where someone had pulled back the curtain to look out. She felt the full particular weight of being a story that a town was already deciding how to tell. "I don't know you," she said. "No, you don't." He didn't look like that bothered him. That's not a reassurance. Wasn't meant to be. He reached down and picked up her trunk, the worn leather one with the brass clasp that had belonged to her mother, and set it on the porch out of the dirt without asking. Then he turned back to her. "Name's Silas Mercer. I've lived in this valley 8 years. You can ask anyone here whether I'm a man to be trusted. You can ask Harmon in the general store, or the Kelsey family on the North Road, or the Reverend if you want a religious opinion, or you don't ask anybody and you take your chances either way. Up to you." She looked at him for a long moment. She looked at Thomas Greer on his porch with his hat in his hands and his clean shirt and his too-late apologies. She looked at her trunk. She looked down the main street of Coldwater Ridge, 2 blocks of raw lumber and 1 water tower, and 400 people who had just watched her get discarded in the open air like something that hadn't come out right. "You said it needs work," she said. "The cabin. Considerable. I'm not afraid of work." He studied her. "No," he said, after a moment, like he was confirming something he'd already suspected. "I don't imagine you are." She learned what she could about him from the town before she left it, which wasn't much, because Coldwater Ridge had the particular relationship with Silas Mercer that small communities often have with solitary men who live on the edge of their geography and their comprehension. They knew of him without knowing him, respected him without understanding him, and left him mostly alone by mutual, silent agreement. Harmon, behind the counter of the general store, confirmed he was trustworthy in the blunt economic way of shopkeepers. "He pays what he owes, and he doesn't cause trouble, and he's never once come in here smelling like a problem." From the Kelsey woman, who lived with her husband and 3 children in the farmhouse at the north end of town, and who had the direct, unsentimental manner of a person who had simply lived too much to bother with social nicety. "He pulled my youngest out of the river 3 springs ago when the thaw came fast. Didn't say much about it then, hasn't said much about it since. That tells you what you need to know about the kind of man he is." Margaret stood in the general store with a list that Silas had handed her. Just a piece of paper folded in 2, with provisions written in a spare hand, nothing wasted, and she bought what was on it with the money she had, which wasn't much but was hers, and she refused the credit that Harmon offered her twice, and that Thomas Greer sent word over to extend. "Tell Mr. Greer that his charity is appreciated but unnecessary," she told Harmon. Harmon looked at her over his spectacles for a moment with the expression of a man recalculating a situation. Then he wrapped up her purchases and didn't mention Thomas Greer again. She sat on the porch of the general store and waited for Silas to bring the horses around, and she watched the last of the afternoon light slide down the mountain behind the town and thought about exactly nothing for about 3 minutes, which was the closest thing to peace she'd had since the Missouri crossing. A woman came and sat near her, not beside her. A few feet down the bench, the way you'd sit if you wanted to have a conversation, but also preserve the option of pretending you weren't. She was perhaps 60, with iron gray hair and the tanned, seamed face of someone who had never in her life considered the matter of complexion. She had a basket on her arm, and she looked straight ahead at the street. "That was Thomas's own doing," the woman said, without preamble. "Whatever he told himself. He'd been working himself up to backing out since before you left Ohio, I'd guess. A man like that needs a reason to do the cowardly thing, so he waits until the moment that gives him the most cover." Margaret looked at her. "I don't know you." "Dottie Crane. I run the boarding house on the East Road." She paused. "The one he offered to put you up in." "Ah, I wouldn't have taken his money for your room anyway." She said it matter-of-factly. "Wouldn't have felt right." Margaret didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. "Silas Mercer is a decent man," Dottie Crane said. "He's difficult and he doesn't talk much and he lives up that mountain like a hermit, and I'll be honest with you, I don't fully understand him. But he's decent, and out here that counts for more than people give it credit for." "Why did he do it?" Margaret asked. "Step in like that. He doesn't know me." Dottie Crane was quiet for a moment. She smoothed the handle of her basket. "Some men can't abide a certain kind of wrong being done in front of them. Doesn't matter who it's being done to." She stood up from the bench. "You'll be cold up there. Make sure you've got enough blanket." Then she walked off down the street, and that was that. Silas came around with 2 horses at 6 o'clock, a big dark bay for himself and a quieter roan for her trunk tied on behind with a rope that looked like it had held a great deal of things together over the years. He looked at her provisions. He looked at the list. He looked back at the provisions. Something passed across his face. Not quite satisfaction, but the absence of complaint, which she was beginning to think might be his version of approval. "You ride?" he asked. "I've ridden. Not recently. It's a mountain trail. Gets narrow in places. I'll manage." He looked at her a moment longer. Then he handed her the roan's reins and mounted his own horse without another word. They rode out of Coldwater Ridge in the last of the evening light, through the town's north edge and up the switchback trail that climbed out of the valley, and Margaret did not look back. She considered it, the pulling away sentiment that a moment like that seemed to demand, the backwards glance at the town and the life she'd imagined, and the man on the porch who had decided she wasn't worth keeping. And she decided against it. There was a mountain in front of her and a trail that was getting narrower and darker by the minute, and a horse under her that she was still getting acquainted with, and those things required attention. Silas rode ahead, not fast, keeping to a pace the trail allowed and that she could reasonably follow. He didn't talk. She didn't either. The pines came in thicker on either side as they climbed, and the light went from orange to gray to a deep mountain dark that was nothing like the dark she knew from Ohio. Sharper, cleaner, thin with altitude, full of sounds that were unfamiliar enough to keep her alert. After maybe an hour of riding, he stopped at a flat place where a creek crossed the trail and let the horses drink. "You holding up?" he asked. "Yes." She shifted in the saddle. Her lower back was making itself known. "Another hour." "All right." He watched the horses drink. He had this quality of silence that wasn't uncomfortable exactly, but wasn't quite comfortable either. It was just honest, the silence of someone who didn't fill gaps with noise for the sake of it. "You don't have to keep me company," she said. "Conversationally, I mean, if you don't have anything to say." He looked at her. In the dark, she couldn't read his expression. "I know that. I just want to be clear that I'm not going to... I don't have expectations about anything, except the roof you mentioned." "The roof's a problem," he said. "Front bedroom corner's been leaking since the fall. I've been putting a bucket under it. I can fix a roof." He looked at her again. "You can. I can fix most things. I've had to." He seemed to consider this. Then he clicked to his horse and started up the trail again. She followed, and the creek noise faded behind them, and the mountain closed in dark and quiet and immense on both sides. She smelled wood smoke before she saw it, the first warm thing she'd encountered in what felt like days. The cabin sat in a clearing on the east